There is a 40-second scene in Season 2 of Rick and Morty where the smartest being in the universe sits alone in his garage, comforts a suffering creature, vaporizes it, and then puts his own head in the machine. The show does not comment on this. No character finds out. The next episode moves on like it never happened. That scene is the entire show, and almost nobody talks about it. Most people who watch Rick and Morty see a genius having wild adventures. They see the cool grandfather who blows up planets and argues with gods and wins every argument before the other person finishes their first sentence. They see the nihilism and call it intelligence. They see the not caring and call it freedom. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this person coming over 100 years ago. He wrote the warning down. And then Rick Sanchez showed up and became every single thing Nietzsche was afraid of. Optimized for television, wrapped in comedy, and handed to a generation that was too busy laughing to hear what was being said. Welcome to Ricktopus. Let's begin. The man who killed God and then had to live with it. There is a moment in the very first episode of Rick and Morty that most people laugh at and immediately forget. Rick is sitting at the breakfast table with his family. His granddaughter Summer is asking about God, and Rick turns to her, completely calm, completely certain, and says, "There is no God, Summer. You have to rip that band-aid off now. You will thank me later." No dramatic music, no one argues with him. The show moves on in about 4 seconds, but that 4-second moment is the entire show. Everything that happens across 8 seasons, every planet Rick destroys, every relationship he ruins, every bottle he empties at 3 in the morning in a garage while his family sleeps upstairs, all of it flows directly from that one sentence at the breakfast table. Because Rick is not just saying he does not believe in God. He is saying something much heavier than that. He is saying that the thing most people use to make their lives feel like they mean something is gone, and everyone should accept this as quickly as possible, and there is nothing coming to replace it. Friedrich Nietzsche said almost the exact same thing in the 1880s. He wrote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." People read that line and think it is an atheist victory lap. It is the opposite. Nietzsche was not celebrating. He was terrified. When he wrote that God is dead, he was not talking about whether a divine being actually existed. He was talking about what God had been doing for humanity for centuries before science and reason started pulling the foundation out from underneath religion. God had been the ceiling, the thing above everything else that gave the whole structure its shape. Meaning lived under that ceiling. Purpose lived under it. The difference between right and wrong lived under it. Even people who never thought much about theology were living inside a building that God held up, and most of them had no idea the building existed at all because they had never had to think about it. Then along comes modern science. Along comes reason. Along comes the slow, grinding erosion of the idea that a divine hand is guiding anything. And Nietzsche looked at this and did not cheer. He looked at this and said, "What happens to the building now?" Rick Sanchez is what happens to the building now. He is the smartest person in every room he has ever walked into. He has traveled to infinite dimensions. He has watched civilizations rise and collapse. He has met beings that would qualify as gods in any human religious tradition and found them to be, in his words, largely disappointing. His portal gun lets him go anywhere. His intelligence lets him understand anything. And the combination of those two things means he cannot lie to himself about the universe the way most people can. Most people manage the terror of meaninglessness by simply not looking directly at it. They stay busy. They watch television. They fall in love and call it fate. They tell themselves a story about why their particular life in their particular corner of one particular planet in one ordinary galaxy matters. Rick cannot do this. Not because he is broken, because he is honest. And that honesty, which Nietzsche would have recognized immediately, has cost him everything. Look at what the portal gun actually does to a person. In the 6th episode of Season 1, called Rick Potion Number 9, Rick makes a mistake. He creates a love potion for Morty that goes catastrophically wrong, and by the end of the episode, the entire population of Earth has been mutated into horrifying creatures. The world as they know it is gone. And Rick's solution is not to fix it. His solution is to find a parallel dimension where a version of himself had already solved the problem, but where that version of himself and that version of Morty both happen to die moments after solving it. He brings himself and Morty to that dimension. They bury their own dead bodies in the backyard, and then they go inside and have dinner with the family. Morty cannot handle this. He sits in the backyard staring at his own grave, shaking. Rick treats it as a logistical task that has been completed successfully. This is what infinite access to parallel realities does to your relationship with consequences. If you can always find a dimension where things worked out, the dimension where they did not work out stops meaning anything. If there are infinite versions of every choice you could ever make, then no single single choice carries any real weight. The building Nietzsche was describing, the one that God used to hold up, that building was also made of consequences. It was made of the idea that what you do here, in this life, to these people, matters in a way that cannot be undone or replaced. Rick's portal gun is a machine for dismantling that idea one dimension at a time. And he built it himself. That is the detail that matters most. Rick did not stumble into the philosophy of meaninglessness by accident. He engineered his way there. He is, as the show tells you repeatedly, the most intelligent being in the universe. He understands exactly what his technology has done to his ability to believe that anything is permanent or irreplaceable. He understands this the way a surgeon understands human anatomy, not as an abstract idea, but as a working knowledge of every component and how it connects to every other component. And he keeps drinking anyway. He keeps destroying things anyway. He keeps moving from dimension to dimension anyway, because the alternative is to stop and feel the full weight of what he knows. Nietzsche wrote about what he called passive nihilism. He meant the response to meaninglessness that collapses inward. The person who sees that the old certainties are gone and instead of building something new, simply stops trying. They numb themselves. They drift. They find ways to pass the time that do not require believing in anything. Rick's alcoholism is the show's most visible marker of this. He drinks in every situation, at every hour, in the middle of conversations, during emergencies, while piloting spacecraft. The show is careful not to make this funny in the way that most cartoon drinking is funny. It is shown too consistently, too quietly, too automatically. He does not drink because he is having fun. He drinks because being conscious without something to blunt the edges of his own intelligence is genuinely unbearable. In the second episode of Season 2, there is a story about Rick meeting a creature named Unity, a being he used to date, a hive mind that has taken over an entire planet. While they reconnect, Rick spirals into an extended self-destruction that involves every drug and experience available on the planet. At one point, Unity herself, in a letter she leaves when she finally breaks things off, tells Rick something that the show does not comment on or explain. Recreational substances were phased out here. There is no need for escape from the self when your world is one. Unity is describing herself, a being so thoroughly unified that there is no separate self to escape from. And she is telling Rick directly that what he does with substances is escape, not recreation, not relaxation, escape from himself, from the consciousness that has access to infinite dimensions and understands all of them and finds peace in none of them. Nietzsche had a name for what happens to a person who has this kind of intelligence but cannot build anything out of it. He called it the death of God, not just as a theological fact, but as a psychological event. The moment when the person realizes that there is no higher authority, no external source of meaning, no ceiling above them, and instead of filling that space with something of their own creation, they look up at the emptiness and feel only the cold. Rick looks up at the emptiness in the very first episode, at the breakfast table, when he tells Summer there is no God. He sounds calm. He sounds like he is simply stating a fact, and for him, it is simply a fact. He figured this out a long time ago. What the show spends 8 seasons doing is showing you what a person looks like after decades of living with that fact without ever finding a way to make peace with it. He is extraordinarily capable. He can build anything. He can go anywhere. He can win every argument and survive every threat and outthink every opponent. And he sits in a garage in suburban America drinking something green out of a flask because the intelligence that makes him capable of everything has also made it impossible for him to convince himself that any of it matters. That is what Nietzsche was warning about. Not stupidity, not ignorance, not a failure of reason. The warning was about exactly this. The person who is right about the meaninglessness of the universe, who cannot unknow what they know, and who has no idea what to build in the space where meaning used to live. Most people who watch Rick and Morty see a genius having wild adventures. They see the cool grandfather who blows up planets and talks back to gods. They laugh at the catchphrase. They buy the t-shirt. They do not hear what the catchphrase actually means. In the 5th episode of Season 1, called Me Seeks and Destroy, Rick's friend Bird Person explains to Summer what the catchphrase translates to in his language. He says it means, "I am in great pain. Please help me." Summer laughs. The show moves on. Nietzsche would not have laughed. He would have recognized exactly what was happening. A culture absorbing a man's deepest confession as entertainment, wearing it on merchandise, shouting it at cameras, posting it online without ever once stopping to hear what was being said. A man standing in the ruins of a building that used to mean something, holding a flask, saying over and over in a language nobody speaks, "I am in great pain. Please help me." And the world blinks and says it discovered happiness. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But here is the thing about a man who has killed God and has to live with it. He does not live with it alone. He brings someone with him. He brings a 14-year-old boy into the wreckage, hands him a flask, and calls it an adventure. And what that does to the boy, and what the boy eventually does back to the man, is where this story gets genuinely complicated. Section 2. The Ubermensch who refuses to be one. There is a version of Rick Sanchez that Nietzsche would have loved. Think about what Rick actually is for a moment. Not the drunk in the garage. Not the man slumped over his workbench at 3 in the morning. Think about what he can do. He built a portal gun that lets him travel to any of the infinite dimensions in existence. He destroyed the economy of an entire galactic government by hacking it from inside a prison. He defeated the most powerful military organization in the universe using nothing but his own intelligence and a fake memory. He created life. He ended civilizations. He once built a miniature universe inside his car battery and populated it with beings who had no idea they were living inside a power source. And he did it on an afternoon because he needed the electricity. By any measurement that has ever existed for human greatness, Rick Sanchez is beyond it. And Nietzsche had a word for that. He spent the last productive years of his life trying to describe what a human being could become if they fully broke free from the herd, created their own values, stopped looking to any external authority for permission, and turned the full force of their will toward becoming something genuinely extraordinary. He called this person the Ubermensch, the overman, the being that justifies human existence by proving what human existence can reach. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I teach you the Ubermensch. Man is something that should be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? Rick has overcome him. That is the problem. Because what Nietzsche meant by the Ubermensch was not just raw power. It was not simply the ability to do things no one else could do. The Ubermensch was defined by what that power was used for. Nietzsche was specific about this. The overman does not use his extraordinary capability to dominate others or to escape from life. He uses it to create, to build new values in the space where the old ones collapsed, to affirm life so completely and so personally that his existence becomes its own justification. The Ubermensch says yes to everything, to the suffering, to the chaos, to the meaninglessness, and transforms all of it into something that gives the world a new kind of meaning it did not have before. Rick takes all of that capability and points it at nothing. He does not create new values. He destroys the old ones and leaves the space empty. He does not affirm life. He tolerates it on his better days and tries to end it on his worst ones. He does not build anything that lasts, not because he cannot, but because the moment something starts to matter, he finds a way to blow it up, or walk away from it, or pickle himself to avoid going to therapy about it. The clearest evidence of this is not in a single episode. It is in the structure of his entire life. Rick C137, the specific Rick the show follows, was once the founding figure of the Citadel of Ricks. This was an entire civilization built from versions of himself drawn from across infinite dimensions. Every Rick who had ever developed portal technology, every Rick who had ever achieved what Rick achieved, eventually found their way into this organization. And the Rick the show follows was the one who started it. He was the organizing intelligence behind a civilization of infinite genius, and then he abandoned it. Not because it failed, because it succeeded. Because building a civilization meant becoming part of one, and becoming part of one meant submitting to exactly the kind of collective authority that the Ubermensch was supposed to transcend. So he walked away from the single most extraordinary thing any being in any dimension had ever constructed, and went back to a suburban garage in a dimension that was not even originally his, to drink alone and argue with a 14-year-old about going to school. Nietzsche's Zarathustra comes down from his mountain after years of solitude, filled with the wisdom he has gathered, ready to give it to humanity. The crowd in the marketplace laughs at him, and Zarathustra learns something painful. The gift he wants to give cannot be received by people who have not done the work of preparing themselves for it. You cannot hand someone the Ubermensch. You can only point toward it and hope they move in that direction themselves. Rick does not even point. He does the opposite. In the third episode of season 3, called Pickle Rick, Rick turns himself into a pickle specifically to avoid going to a family therapy session. This is not a throwaway absurdist gag, even though it looks like one. Think about what it actually represents. A man of unlimited intelligence, a man who could restructure the fabric of reality on a Tuesday afternoon, chooses to transform himself into a vegetable rather than sit in a room and have an honest conversation about how he treats the people he loves. He then spends the episode engineering an escape from the sewer using rat bones and cockroach parts, fighting his way through an entire building full of armed guards, and arriving at the therapy session anyway, having gone through 10 times more effort to avoid the conversation than the conversation itself would have required. The therapist in that episode is named Dr. Wong. She is not impressed by the pickle story. She sits across from Rick and says something that the show frames as a direct answer to everything Rick has been performing across 3 seasons. I have no doubt that you would be the last man standing after an apocalypse, and perhaps the loneliest. And then she says something even more precise. She says that Rick has the ability to recognize which parts of his life are beneath him and yet does not eliminate them. She is saying, you know exactly what you are doing. You are choosing this. Rick has no comeback. In a show where Rick wins every argument against every god, alien, and government that has ever existed, he sits in a therapist's office and says nothing, because she is right. Not wrong that he can disprove right, just right. Nietzsche described the Ubermensch as someone who had organized the chaos within himself, not eliminated it, but shaped it into something unified and directed. He used the image of a dancing star. He wrote that one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Rick has more chaos than any being in the universe. He has never once organized it. He has never turned it toward creation. He has spent decades using his extraordinary capability to stay exactly where he is, emotionally, which is nowhere. This is the specific failure the show is diagnosing. Not that Rick is evil, not that he is stupid, not that he is simply self-destructive in the ordinary way that troubled characters in television are self-destructive. The failure is precisely Nietzschean. He has everything the Overman requires and refuses the last step. He will not create. He will not commit. He will not say yes to anything long enough for it to change him. Look at what happens in season 6 when Rick finally comes face to face with the being who murdered his wife and daughter, Rick Prime, the other version of himself who set off the bomb that took everything from him. Rick has been hunting this being for decades across infinite dimensions. When he finally gets close in the episode Rick Mirai Jack, the revenge does not feel triumphant. It feels hollow. And then in season 7, in the episode called Unmortrican, he actually kills Rick Prime. He beats him to death. The show does not let this feel good. It is exhausting to watch. There is no music swelling. There is no release. Rick gets the thing he has organized his entire life around achieving, and the achievement empties rather than fills him. Because the revenge was not a value he created. It was a reaction to something that was done to him. It was suffering wearing the costume of purpose, and the moment it ended, the costume fell off. The Ubermensch, in Nietzsche's understanding, does not derive his values from what happened to him. He creates them from what he chooses to become. Rick has spent his whole life confusing those two things. His intelligence, the very thing that should have made him capable of the distinction, has instead been used to dress up reaction as choice and call it philosophy. Now look at what the show does with Jerry. Jerry Smith, Rick's son-in-law, is in almost every way Rick's opposite. He is not intelligent. He is not capable. He is not extraordinary by any measure that Rick or Nietzsche would recognize. He works ordinary jobs, watches ordinary television, makes ordinary jokes that land with a thud, and finds genuine contentment in a life that Rick would consider beneath contempt. Rick treats Jerry with a specific kind of disgust that is different from how he treats other people he dislikes. With enemies, he is strategic. With people he respects, he is combative. With Jerry, he is almost philosophically offended. The way you might be offended by someone who is not just wrong about something, but wrong in a way that makes you angry they do not even know they are wrong. Nietzsche described this type too. He called it the last man, the person who has settled so completely into comfort and mediocrity that they have lost even the desire to be more than they are. The last man does not suffer from meaninglessness because he does not reach high enough to encounter it. He discovers happiness in small things and blinks. He is content. And for Nietzsche, contentment without striving was not peace. It was the end of everything worth calling human. Jerry is the last man. Rick knows this. And Rick's contempt for Jerry is the contempt of a man who, at some level, is aware that Jerry's contentment is something he will never have. Not because Jerry earned it, but because Rick made himself incapable of it the moment he understood the universe clearly enough to see what contentment costs. But here is what makes this more than just a story about a brilliant person who cannot be happy. Here is where the show starts doing something that most analysis never reaches. Rick cannot achieve the Ubermensch, but he also cannot fall back into being the last man. He is stuck in the space between. He is too aware to accept comfort, too broken to create meaning, too intelligent to lie to himself, and too human, despite everything, to stop caring about the people around him even when he desperately wants to. Nietzsche said, "Man is a rope fastened between animal and Ubermensch, a rope over an abyss. Rick is not the animal. He is not the Ubermensch. He is the rope. And the abyss is not below him. The abyss is him. There is a character in this story who exists in the same house as Rick, breathes the same air, goes on the same adventures, and has been slowly, quietly, without anyone fully noticing, learning something from all of it. And that character is not who you think he is. Because the show that everyone calls Rick and Morty is not actually about Rick. It never was. Rick is the warning. Morty is the question. And the question is, what does a person become when they grow up inside the abyss? Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That question, and what Jerry's comfortable smallness has to do with answering it, that is where Section 3 begins. Section 3, the last man in Rick's living room. Jerry Smith does not blow up planets. He does not build portal guns or fight alien governments or turn himself into a vegetable to avoid his feelings. He does not have a catchphrase that secretly means he is in great pain. He does not sit alone in a garage at 3 in the morning building devices that could end his life if he stayed conscious long enough to finish them. Jerry Smith watches television. He makes sandwiches. He tells jokes that do not land. He works jobs that he loses and then finds other jobs just as ordinary as the ones he lost. He loves his wife in the way that makes her feel slightly embarrassed. He asks for approval from people who have already decided not to give it to him, and then he asks again. He finds happiness in small things, a compliment, a decent meal, an afternoon where nobody is disappointed in him, and he treats that happiness like it is enough. Most people who watch the show write Jerry off as the joke, the punching bag, the man the show keeps around so that Rick has someone to be smarter than. And it is true that the show does use Jerry this way constantly. Rick barely looks at him when he talks. The family treats his opinions as noise. Even Morty, who is genuinely kind-hearted, has learned to filter out most of what Jerry says. But here's the thing. Friedrich Nietzsche spent a significant portion of his most important work describing Jerry Smith in extraordinary detail, more than a century before Jerry Smith existed. He called this person the last man. In his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote a passage about what he saw as the most dangerous possible future for humanity. Not a future of war or chaos or destruction, a future of comfort. He described a humanity that had stopped striving for anything, that had organized itself entirely around the removal of discomfort, that had traded the difficult and the extraordinary for the safe and the manageable. He described people who still worked, but only because work was a form of entertainment that did not exhaust them. People who had little poison now and then, meaning small pleasures, minor distractions, tiny vices, to keep things interesting without risking anything. People who had no shepherd and no individual direction, just one enormous herd all moving in the same direction at the same speed toward the same goal, which was to feel okay and not feel too much of anything else. And Nietzsche described the worst part. These people, the last men, had discovered happiness, and they blinked. That is the word he used. Blinked. Not rejoiced, not celebrated, not burst with gratitude. They blinked. The small, satisfied, unthinking blink of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for and does not understand why anyone would want more. Jerry blinks constantly. Go back and watch any Jerry scene in the first 3 seasons. Not the scenes where he is the butt of the joke. The scenes where Jerry is just being Jerry, where he is having a good day, where Beth said something kind or one of the kids needed him or a stranger complimented his driving. Watch what happens to his face. It is genuinely content. Not performing contentment for someone else. Actually, simply, contentedly content, in the way that you would have to go somewhere very quiet inside yourself to feel. Jerry does not have a roaring inner life eating through everything. Jerry has a comfortable chair and a television and a marriage he loves more than it loves him back, and he has built a small, warm, survivable world inside those things, and he lives there without complaint. Nietzsche would not have hated Jerry. He would have pitied him, which, in Nietzsche's framework, was considerably worse. Because the last man is not evil. That is the point. If the last man were evil, he could at least be fought. He could at least generate the kind of friction that produces something. The last man is soft. He makes everything around him soft. He does not resist anything or push against anything or demand anything from himself or anyone else beyond the basic requirements for staying comfortable. And for Nietzsche, a civilization of last men, a world full of Jerrys, was not a peaceful world. It was a dying one. Not with violence, but with a long, slow, satisfied exhale. Now look at how the show positions Jerry next to Rick. Not in individual scenes, but as a structural choice across the entire series. Rick and Jerry are foils. That word means two characters who are placed next to each other, specifically so that what one is makes the other clearer by contrast. Rick is in constant motion, intellectually, physically, emotionally, even when he is trying not to be. He cannot stop. Even his attempts at rest are a kind of furious activity. His garage is not a relaxing space. It is a laboratory full of half-finished experiments and alien technology, and the residue of a mind that runs so hot it burns through everything around it. Jerry's equivalent of the garage is the couch, and the contrast between those two spaces is the show's entire argument made physical. In the second episode of Season 1, called Lawnmower Dog, Rick gives Jerry's dog a brain-enhancing helmet as a casual favor. Within one episode, the dog has organized a global revolution, enslaved humanity, and built a civilization. Jerry, during all of this, remains primarily concerned with whether his wife is impressed by him and whether his job is going okay. The episode is chaos from beginning to end. Jerry's arc in it is whether he feels good about himself today. The show does this repeatedly. The scale of what Rick interacts with versus the scale of what Jerry interacts with is so extreme that it functions as a kind of philosophical diagram. Rick moves through events that reshape the universe. Jerry moves through events that reshape a Tuesday. And yet, there is a Season 2 episode called Big Trouble in Little Sanchez that does something quietly devastating with this dynamic. Rick transfers his consciousness into a teenage clone of himself to infiltrate Morty's high school. Beth and Jerry go to an intergalactic couples counseling center called Nuptia 6. There, a machine called the Synaptic Transfer System extracts and visualizes how Beth and Jerry perceive each other. Jerry's mental image of Beth is a powerful, terrifying predator. Beth's mental image of Jerry is a weak, pathetic creature barely capable of surviving on its own. This is not played primarily for laughs. The show holds on it long enough to make it sting, because what the episode is showing is not just that Beth and Jerry have a bad marriage. It is showing how two people can live in the same house, share the same children, eat at the same table every morning, and be living in completely different realities that have almost no overlap. Jerry sees Beth as extraordinary and frightening and beyond him. Beth sees Jerry as small and safe and not enough, and neither of them are entirely wrong. Jerry genuinely admires Beth in a way that has tipped into something closer to fear. Beth genuinely feels that Jerry represents a life she settled for, a smaller life than the one she might have had if Rick had stayed when she was young. What the episode is really about is what happens to the people caught between the last man and the person who cannot become the Ubermensch. Beth is not Rick. She is not capable of what Rick is capable of, but she was raised by him, shaped by his absence, defined partly by what it meant to be his daughter. She wants more than Jerry. She does not fully know what more looks like, and Jerry, standing next to that wanting, will always feel the gap. Nietzsche wrote that the last man does not just fail himself, he makes everything around him smaller by proximity, not through cruelty, through the gravity of his own settled smallness, which pulls at the people who love him and asks them, quietly and constantly, to want less. This is what Jerry does to the family. Not maliciously. He could not be malicious if he tried. He simply exists as a living argument that comfort is enough, that less is fine, that the Tuesday-sized life is a life worth having, and every member of the family has to decide, consciously or not, whether to believe him. Summer sometimes does. She is the most socially oriented member of the family, the most invested in how she is seen by the people around her, the most likely to build her identity out of group belonging rather than individual direction. In the third episode of Season 3, called Rick Mancing the Stone, Summer throws herself into a post-apocalyptic world with an almost aggressive enthusiasm. Not because she genuinely believes in anything there, but because she is running from the feeling that home is the couch and the television, and a version of her parents slowly pulling apart at the seams. Morty runs the opposite direction, into Rick. And this is where the dynamic between Jerry and Rick stops being just a philosophical diagram and becomes something the show is actually worried about. Because the show is not arguing that Jerry is wrong to want comfort. It is not saying that everyone should be Rick, should push to the edge of every dimension and feel the full, unfiltered weight of infinite meaninglessness just to prove they can. Nietzsche was not saying that either. Nietzsche was saying that a world organized entirely around Jerry's values, around the removal of discomfort and the discovery of small happiness and the gentle management of expectations, is a world that has stopped producing anything worth calling greatness. It has stopped building dancing stars. It has filled the time instead, comfortably, blinkingly, between small poisons and soft entertainments. Jerry does not watch Rick destroy himself across 8 seasons and think, I should do something about this. Jerry watches Rick destroy himself and thinks, at least that is not me, and he goes back to the couch. And Rick watches Jerry settle into into the couch with that specific contentment that Rick will never feel. And something in Rick, buried under the alcohol and the cynicism and the philosophy and the portal gun, something in Rick almost envies it, almost. He would never admit this. He barely admits it to himself. But the contempt Rick feels for Jerry has always had something else underneath it. Something that looks, if you tilt your head at the right angle, a little like grief. Because Rick was Jerry once, before the bomb went off, before he lost everything that made caring about a Tuesday feel like enough. There was a version of Rick Sanchez who did not have the portal gun and did not know about infinite dimensions, and came home from work and ate dinner with his wife and his daughter and thought, this is enough. This is the life. This means something. And then something took that version away, took it violently and permanently, and the man left behind built philosophy out of the wreckage and called it intelligence and pointed the whole construction at a boy named Morty and said, come on, let me show you how the universe actually works. What that did to Morty, the slow, specific, real damage of growing up inside Rick's worldview, is something the show builds carefully and confirms brutally. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before we get there, we need to talk about the version of Rick that the audience never sees. The one he hides so completely that most of the characters in the show do not know it exists. The one the show has been quietly revealing, piece by piece, since the first season. Because the man performing the philosophy and the man feeling the consequences of it are not the same person. And the distance between them is the most important distance in the entire show. Section 4. The costume. Why Rick's nihilism is a performance. There is a scene near the end of the third episode of Season 2 that most people who watch Rick and Morty remember. Not because it is funny, because it is not funny at all. The episode is called Autoerotic Assimilation. For most of its runtime, it looks like a typical Rick and Morty adventure. Rick reconnects with an old girlfriend named Unity, who happens to be a hive mind, a single consciousness that has taken over every living being on an entire planet. They spend the episode in a kind of extended reunion, using the bodies of the planet's population for increasingly extreme activities, while Morty and Summer wander around getting into trouble. The surface of the episode is loud and chaotic and often genuinely funny. And then Unity leaves. She sends Rick a letter. She explains that being around him causes her to lose herself, that his influence is so total, so consuming, that even a being capable of controlling an entire planet's population cannot maintain her own identity in his presence. She tells him she has to go, and she goes. Rick comes home. Beth confronts him about something unrelated, an alien he had been keeping in the basement. Rick, who never backs down from anything, who turns every confrontation into an argument he wins before the other person finishes their first sentence, simply agrees to Beth's demands. No argument, no sarcasm, no counterattack. He just nods and walks to the garage. What happens in the garage is one of the most quietly devastating sequences in the history of adult animation. Rick does not pour a drink. He does not call someone. He does not start a new experiment or pull out his portal gun or find somewhere else to be. He goes to a workbench and begins assembling a device. He opens a small container where a tiny creature has been frozen, a small, deformed, suffering animal that has clearly been in pain for a long time. Rick unfreezes it. He holds it gently. He comforts it while it screams, and then he vaporizes it with the device he just assembled, ending its suffering. Then he puts his own head where the creature's head was. He is going to do the same thing to himself. The machine begins warming up, and then Rick passes out, the alcohol finally pulling him under before the machine can complete its cycle. He collapses face first onto the workbench. The machine powers down. He lies there through the night, and the episode ends the next morning with him still slumped at his desk, and Jerry outside cheerfully doing yard work, completely unaware that anything happened. The show does not comment on this. No character finds out. No one processes it in the next episode. The show simply lets it sit there, like a stone dropped in still water, and moves on. This is the scene the show has been building towards since the pilot. Everything Rick performs in front of other people, the arrogance, the dismissiveness, the philosophy of nothing matters, the constant forward motion, the drinking, the chaos, all of it is visible in that garage scene for what it actually is. Not a worldview, a wall. The most sophisticated wall a person can build, constructed from genuine intelligence and real capability, and a philosophy that happens to be partly true, and deployed constantly and completely to make sure that nobody, including Rick himself, ever has to look at what is on the other side of it. Nietzsche called this the costume. He was not talking about literal clothing. He was describing the way people build an outward presentation of themselves, a set of behaviors, beliefs, and performances that looks from the outside like a complete picture of who they are, but is actually a layer covering something they cannot face directly. The costume does not have to be false to be a costume. Rick's nihilism is not entirely false. He genuinely genuinely understands things about the universe that most beings cannot handle. His intelligence is real. His capability is real. But the way he deploys these things, the performance of not caring, the aggressive certainty that nothing matters, the refusal to be known by anyone, that is the costume. And underneath it is the garage scene. A man who comforts a suffering creature before ending its pain and then tries to end his own. The word Nietzsche used for people like this was not broken or lost or even sad. He said they were wearing a costume. He meant something precise by this. He meant that the external performance and the internal reality had separated so completely that even the person wearing the costume had begun to believe it was their face. Rick has believed it is his face for a very long time. Go back to the pilot episode. Rick and Morty have accidentally turned most of humanity into monsters because of a love potion that went wrong. Rick's solution, as discussed earlier, is to take them to a parallel dimension and bury their own dead bodies. Morty falls apart. Rick is calm, efficient. Problem identified, problem solved, next. But watch what Rick says to Morty in that scene. Not what he does, what he says. He tells Morty, nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. He says this while helping Morty through the practical steps of burying himself. He is performing the philosophy at the exact moment when performing it is most necessary. When, if he stopped performing it for even a second, he would have to feel what it actually means to dig a grave for yourself in a world you accidentally destroyed. The philosophy is load-bearing. It is not something Rick believes and then acts from. It is something Rick performs in order to keep moving. There is a difference, and the show knows there is a difference, and it spends 8 seasons showing you the gap between them. Look at the specific things Rick does when no one is watching, or when he believes the stakes are low enough that he can let the costume slip. In the first season episode called Me Seeks and Destroy, Rick and Morty go on an adventure that Morty gets to plan entirely. The adventure is Morty's idea, Morty's direction, Morty's rules, and Rick goes along with it. Not cheerfully. He complains, he makes fun of it, he is visibly uncomfortable with not being in control, but he goes along with it. A man who claims nothing matters and no one is worth genuine consideration gives his 14-year-old grandson an entire adventure built around the grandson's wishes. Because on some level that he would never name out loud, Morty's wishes matter to him. This happens constantly. In nearly every episode where Rick appears to be doing something entirely for selfish reasons, there is a moment, usually small, usually quick, usually wrapped in enough sarcasm that it is deniable, where the thing he actually cares about leaks through the costume. In the Season 1 episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Rick is framed for the murders of several alternate versions of himself. The evidence against him is overwhelming. His own family believes he is guilty. He is arrested and put on trial by the Council of Ricks, a governing body of infinite versions of himself. And throughout all of this, his primary concern is not his own freedom or reputation. It is making sure Morty is okay. He engineers his entire escape in a way that keeps Morty safe, at significant additional cost to himself. When Morty asks why Rick needs him specifically as a sidekick, Rick gives an explanation about brainwaves and radar and hiding from enemies. It is a scientific explanation. It sounds cold and practical. But the explanation does not account for the fact that Rick could use any Morty from any dimension. He uses this one. He comes back to this one. He is upset in ways he never fully articulates when this one is in danger. The scientific explanation is the costume talking. What is actually happening is something the costume does not have words for. Now look at the Diane AI. This is one of the most important details in the entire show, and it appears quietly, almost in passing, in the first episode of Season 6. Rick's portal fluid resets and sends him back to his original home dimension, Dimension C-137, the dimension where his wife Diane and his daughter Beth were murdered by another version of Rick. When Rick arrives at his old house, a voice greets him from inside. It is an artificial intelligence he built, modeled on Diane's voice, programmed to remind him of his failure to protect her and to keep pushing him toward revenge against her killer. Sit with that for a moment. Rick built a machine that sounds like his dead wife. He built it to haunt him. He built it to make sure he never stopped hurting badly enough to stop hunting. He installed it in the house where she died, and then left that dimension and traveled across infinite realities for years, knowing it was there waiting. A man who performs the philosophy of nothing matters built an elaborate monument to the one thing that has always mattered most to him, and designed it specifically to keep that wound open rather than let it heal. This is the costume at its most complete. The nihilism is not Rick's conclusion, it is his scar tissue. It is the thing that grew over the wound because the wound was so catastrophic that leaving it exposed was not survivable. Nietzsche's costume is not vanity. It is not performance for its own sake. It is protection. The person person wearing it genuinely needed it once. The tragedy is what happens when the protection calcifies, when the thing you built to survive the wound becomes the wall that prevents everything else from getting through too. The therapist Dr. Wong sees this in about 45 minutes. In Pickle Rick, she tells Rick something that the show treats as the most honest assessment of him anyone has ever offered. She says, "The only connection between your undeniable intelligence and the sickness destroying your family is that everyone in your family, you included, use intelligence to justify avoiding your actual feelings." She is not being cruel, she is being precise. She is describing the costume not as a character flaw, but as a coping strategy that has outgrown its usefulness, deployed so completely and for so long that it has become indistinguishable from the person wearing it. Rick's response is to offer her a counter-argument. He says that her job is to help people feel better about their choices. She tells him her job is to help people make better choices. He has no response to this either. The show gives him no comeback, because there is no comeback. She is right. And Rick, who is the smartest being in the universe, knows she is right, which is why he went to such extraordinary lengths to avoid being in the same room as her in the first place. The tragedy of the costume, in Nietzsche's framework, is that the person wearing it is usually the last one to see it. Everyone around them can see the gap between what they perform and what they feel. The people who love them can feel the wall even when they cannot describe it, but the person inside the costume has been wearing it for so long that taking it off feels not like relief, but like exposure, like being asked to walk into a room with no walls in weather that has been trying to kill you for decades. Rick did not build his costume because he is a bad person. He built it because he survived something that most people would not have survived at all, and the tools he used to survive it have become the only tools he knows how to reach for. The nihilism is real, but it is not the whole truth. The not caring is real, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is in the garage, in the small creature comforted before being released from its pain, in the machine built to sound like a dead woman's voice, in the man who passes out on his workbench and wakes up alone while Jerry mows the lawn outside. The costume has been doing its job for a very long time. It has kept everyone at a safe distance. It has kept Rick moving when stopping would have meant feeling everything at once. But there is one person in the show who has been watching the costume from the inside, who has spent years on adventures standing close enough to Rick to see the moments when the wall slips, who has absorbed the philosophy and the chaos and the genuine pain underneath both of them, and who has been quietly, without anyone noticing, building something of his own out of all of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding what that cost him and what it made him requires us to go somewhere even darker than Rick's garage. It requires us to look at the specific civilization Rick built out of infinite versions of himself, what that civilization became, and what it says about the thing that happens when extraordinary individuals stop being individuals and start being a herd. Section 5. Herd Morality and the Citadel of Ricks. Imagine taking the most extraordinary person who has ever existed and making infinite copies of him. Not similar people, not people inspired by him or trained by him or shaped by his influence. Exact copies. Every version of the same man from every possible dimension, drawn together into one place. Every Rick who ever built a portal gun. Every Rick who ever escaped a prison or defeated a government or crossed dimensions that would have killed anyone else. Every single one of them together in the same civilization. You would expect something extraordinary. You would expect a society that functioned at a level no other civilization in any dimension could match. You would expect the most creative, most capable, most individually powerful group of beings ever assembled to produce something that reflected what they each were on their own. What they actually produced was a city with a class system, a police force, a school, a factory, a political campaign, and a group of citizens being oppressed by the people above them. They built exactly what they had escaped. This is the Citadel of Ricks, and it is the most precise piece of Nietzschean storytelling the show ever produced. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about something he called herd morality. He meant the set of values and behaviors that emerge whenever individuals organize into a group, any group, regardless of how capable its individual members are. The herd does not form because people are weak. It forms because people, even extraordinary people, feel the pull of belonging, the desire to be part of something, the comfort of shared rules and shared identity, the safety of knowing that everyone around you is operating by the same set of expectations. And the moment that pull is answered, the moment individuals agree to become a group, something begins to happen to their individual values. The group's needs start overriding the individual's direction. Comfort comfort starts overriding risk. Belonging starts overriding becoming. The herd does not announce that it is flattening everyone inside it. It just does it, quietly, through the accumulated weight of collective expectation. The Citadel of Ricks is this process shown at its most extreme, and its most funny, and its most bleak, all at the same time. The episode that focuses on the Citadel most completely is in Season 3. It is called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, though many fans call it Tales from the Citadel. Rick and Morty themselves barely appear in it. The episode follows several different storylines happening simultaneously inside the Citadel, each one centered on a different Rick or Morty navigating life inside this civilization of infinite genius. There is a Rick who works in a factory making portal guns, the same device that represents Rick's greatest individual achievement, on an assembly line, for wages, under the supervision of other Ricks who treat him as beneath them. He has a small dream of opening a store. His co-workers think it is embarrassing. He is not Rick, the smartest being in the universe. He is Rick, the factory worker, trying to get through his shift. There is a Morty running for president of the Citadel on a platform of unity and change and the promise that things can be better. He seems sincere. The Ricks and Mortys supporting him seem genuinely hopeful. The episode follows his campaign with the kind of energy that makes you want to believe in it. There is a cop Rick who is partnered with a cop Morty, and the episode spends time showing how the Citadel's power structure treats Mortys as second-class citizens, less intelligent, less valuable, less worthy of basic consideration. The cop Rick is not a monster. He is a product of a system that has decided Mortys matter less, and he has absorbed that belief so thoroughly that he does not even examine it. And underneath all of this, the city itself, its streets and schools and coffee shops and political rallies and small daily frustrations. It looks exactly like any other city in any other dimension. It looks, more than anything else, like the ordinary suburban world that Rick C-137 moved into when he landed in the Smith family's garage. The world he spent his whole life being too extraordinary for. Now consider what Nietzsche's herd morality says about this. He wrote that the herd produces a specific kind of moral pressure. Not a dramatic pressure, not a command or a threat, a quiet, constant gravitational pull towards sameness. The herd does not need a leader telling everyone to conform. It just needs enough members all moving in the same direction for the direction itself to start feeling inevitable. Anyone who moves differently starts to feel the friction. And eventually, most people stop moving differently. Not because they are forced to, because friction is exhausting and sameness is warm, and the herd is right there, offering both comfort and belonging if you are willing to let go of whatever made you different. The Citadel is this process running on an infinite supply of the same raw material. Every Rick inside it started as the most individual being in his own universe. Every one of them had broken free from whatever world he came from by being too smart, too capable, too unwilling to operate within the limits other people accepted. And then they gathered together, and the gathering produced a city, and the city produced a class structure, and the class structure produced a factory floor where a Rick assembles portal guns for wages and dreams of a small store and gets laughed at by his coworkers. The most individual person in any dimension, multiplied infinitely, produced the herd. That is the joke. That is also the horror. The political campaign storyline in the episode makes this explicit in its ending. The candidate Morty wins the election. The Citadel celebrates. And then, in the final minutes of the episode, it becomes clear that the candidate Morty is not who he appeared to be. He is evil Morty. A Morty who has spent years planning, operating from the shadows, accumulating power and influence with a patience and coldness that no ordinary Morty possesses. He wins the presidency not through genuine hope, but through the machinery of the herd itself. He gave people what the herd wanted to hear. He understood that a population organized around comfort and belonging and the management of expectations is a population that can be moved by anyone willing to speak the right language. The episode ends with evil Morty having consolidated total control, surrounded by the bodies of everyone who might have challenged him. The camera pulls back. The city continues. The herd moves on. Nietzsche wrote that the herd always ends up following someone, not because the herd is evil, because a group without a direction will accept direction from whoever offers it most confidently. The last men do not want to lead, they want to belong, and whoever understands this well enough can do anything with them. Now look at who founded the Citadel. Rick C-137, the Rick the show follows, was the organizing intelligence behind the Citadel's creation. He did not build it because he believed in collective civilization. He built it as a practical solution to a specific problem. After spending years hunting Rick Prime across infinite dimensions, he had killed enough alternate versions of himself that the surviving Ricks had organized against him. The Citadel was the peace agreement. It was the structure that allowed infinite Ricks Ricks to coexist without destroying each other. And then he abandoned it. He did not leave because the Citadel failed. He left because it was working. Because a working civilization required him to be part of it, and being part of it required him to be one Rick among infinite Ricks, rather than the specific, individual, unrepeatable Rick C137 who made choices that no other version of him would have made. The herd of Ricks was its own kind of flattening. Even among infinite versions of the most extraordinary being in existence, the gathering produced pressure towards sameness, and Rick could not survive sameness. He walked away. This is the tension the show is building across its entire run. Rick is too individual for the herd, but he is also too wounded to achieve what the Ubermensch requires, the creative transformation of his own extraordinary capability into something that builds meaning rather than avoiding it. He is stuck between the two options Nietzsche laid out, belonging to neither, moving constantly to avoid having to choose. The Citadel is what happens when that choice is made badly at scale, when the extraordinary chooses the herd and loses what made it extraordinary in the process, when the dancing stars stop being born because everyone inside the walls has quietly agreed that warmth and belonging matter more than the cold, exposed work of becoming something new. But the Citadel is also a mirror. It shows Rick what he was avoiding when he built his wall and pointed his nihilism at anyone who got close. The herd offers exactly what Rick's costume was built to refuse: the comfort of not being alone, the warmth of shared identity, the soft relief of belonging to something larger than yourself. Rick refused the Citadel. He refuses belonging in every form it takes in the show. He refuses it with philosophy and sarcasm and alcohol and the portal gun and the constant forward motion that makes stopping impossible. What he has never refused, despite all of it, despite every wall and every performance and every time he has tried, is Morty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And what was done to Morty by growing up inside all of this, inside the philosophy and the chaos and the love that Rick performs as indifference, that is where the real wound in this story lives. Because Rick's nihilism did not stay in the garage. It went to school with a 14-year-old boy. It sat across from him in a spaceship. It handed him things he was not ready to hold and called it education. What happened to Morty is the part of this story that Rick would never tell you himself. Section 6. The trauma beneath the philosophy. There is a version of Rick Sanchez that existed before any of this, before the portal gun, before the infinite dimensions, before the drinking and the nihilism and the garage and the decades of running from dimension to dimension looking for something he could not name out loud. There was a version of Rick who came home from work, who ate dinner with his wife, who watched his daughter grow up in the same house in the same dimension without ever having to bury a copy of himself in the backyard. A Rick who had never seen enough of the universe to know for certain that none of it meant anything. A Rick who was, by all available evidence, genuinely happy. His wife was named Diane. His daughter was Beth. He loved them both in the specific, quiet, unremarkable way that people love the people they have built their daily lives around. Not dramatically, not with speeches, but with the accumulated weight of ordinary mornings and shared meals and the kind of comfort that only exists when you have been with someone long enough to stop performing and just be. And then another version of Rick showed up at his door. This other Rick, the show calls him Rick Prime, had already developed the technology for a portal gun. He had already crossed dimensions. He had already seen enough of the infinite universe to have made his peace with what it meant, or decided he did not need to make peace with it. He came to Rick C137 and offered him the same knowledge, the ability to travel across dimensions, the ability to see everything. Rick C137 said no. He said he did not want it. He had Diane. He had Beth. He had a life that was enough. Rick Prime left. And then he sent a bomb through a portal into Rick C137's home, and Diane and Beth died in the explosion. This is the origin. This is the thing underneath everything else. This is what the nihilism is built on top of. The show reveals this across several seasons, building toward it slowly and carefully. The first real glimpse comes in season 3, in the episode called The Rickshank Redemption, where Rick appears to show a memory of this event while inside a Federation prison. He shows the memory of Diane's death, the explosion, the grief that followed, but then he claims the memory was fake, that he constructed it to trick his captors into giving him access to their systems. He tells the audience, essentially, that none of it was real. It was a tool. The show lets this sit for seasons. It lets Rick maintain the costume over his own origin story. It lets him claim that even the most painful moment in his history was just a performance for someone else's benefit. And then season 5 and season 6 confirmed that the memory was real, that Diane and Beth did die, that Rick Prime did kill them, that everything Rick C-137 has done across the entire run of the show, every dimension crossed, every enemy defeated, every version of himself killed in the search, has been, at its foundation, a father and husband trying to find the man who took his family from him. The revenge quest is not a subplot. It is the spine of the entire show. It was there from the beginning, hidden under the chaos and the comedy and the philosophy of nothing matters, waiting for the show to be ready to show it. Nietzsche wrote about what he called passive nihilism. He defined it as the response to meaninglessness that turns inward and collapses. The person who sees that the old certainties are gone, and instead of building something new in their place, simply stops believing in the possibility of building at all. They drift, they numb. They find ways to keep moving that do not require them to be fully present in their own lives. They maintain the appearance of forward motion while actually standing completely still inside, frozen at the moment when everything stopped making sense. Rick's nihilism is passive in this precise way. It is not the conclusion of a man who reasoned his way to a worldview. It is the scar tissue of a man who lost the thing that made reasoning about a worldview unnecessary. He did not decide nothing matters. He was detonated into that position by a bomb sent through a portal by another version of himself, and he built the philosophy out of the wreckage because the wreckage was all that was left. This is the specific detail that separates Rick and Morty from most other portrayals of nihilism in popular culture. Most nihilistic characters arrive at their worldview through intelligence. They think their way to not caring. Rick did not think his way there. He was forced there by grief so complete and so sudden that the only available response was to restructure reality around its absence. Now look at what Rick did immediately after Diane and Beth died. He did not go to therapy. He did not lean on a support system. He built a portal gun on his own from scratch, driven entirely by the need to find Rick Prime across infinite dimensions, and he started hunting. He crossed dimension after dimension, leaving wreckage behind him, killing alternate versions of himself in the process, unable to stop because stopping meant feeling the full weight of what had happened, and the full weight was not survivable. The show reveals in Season 5, in the episode Rick Mirai Jack, that during this period, Rick killed enough alternate versions of himself that the surviving Ricks organized against him. This is how the Citadel was formed, not as a dream Rick had for what a civilization of extraordinary beings could achieve, but as a peace agreement forced on him when his grief-driven rampage became a threat to every version of himself that existed. He built an entire civilization as a side effect of his inability to process loss. And then there is the Diane AI. In the first episode of Season 6, called Solarix, Rick's portal fluid resets and sends him back to his original home dimension, Dimension C-137, the dimension where Diane and Beth were killed. When Rick arrives at his old house, a voice greets him. It is an artificial intelligence built to sound exactly like Diane. Rick built this device himself. He installed it in the house where his wife died. He programmed it to remind him constantly of his failure to protect her, to keep the wound open, to make sure the grief never faded enough to let the drive for revenge fade with it. Think about what this means for a moment. Rick, the man who performs the philosophy of nothing matters, who claims no attachment to anything or anyone, who treats caring about people as a weakness he has long since moved past, built a machine that sounds like his dead wife so that he would never stop hurting badly enough to stop hunting the man who killed her. He built a monument to grief in the house where the grief was born and then left it there, running in a dimension he rarely visited, doing its job in the dark for years. This is not the behavior of a man who believes nothing matters. This is the behavior of a man who believes one specific thing matters so completely, so permanently, so beyond any philosophy he could construct that the only way to keep functioning in its presence is to make sure it never goes quiet. Nietzsche wrote that the most dangerous lie a person can tell themselves is that they have made peace with something they have only buried. The buried thing does not stop being real. It does not stop doing damage. It just does the damage from underground, in ways the person cannot see or acknowledge, shaping every choice and every relationship and every performed indifference from a place they have declared off limits to examination. Rick has declared the whole thing off limits. The grief, the loss, the specific version of himself that existed before the bomb. All of it has been placed behind a wall that the nihilism guards constantly. The philosophy is the security system. Nothing matters means do not come near the thing that matters most. The show builds to the moment when the revenge finally ends in Season 7. In the episode Unmortrican, Rick finds Rick Prime. He kills him. The fight is not triumphant. The killing is exhausting and messy. And when it is over, Rick does not feel what decades of hunting promised he would feel. He feels empty because the revenge was not a value worldview he created out of strength. It was a reaction to something done to him. And reactions, once completed, do not fill the space they occupied. They just leave it vacant. After Rick Prime is dead, something happens in the show that would have been unimaginable in the first 3 seasons. Rick starts going to therapy regularly. He builds a genuine working relationship with Dr. Wong. He lets himself be changed, slowly and reluctantly, by the conversations they have. He starts making different choices. Not dramatic, announced changes, but quiet, almost accidental shifts in how he treats the people around him. In the season 7 finale, called Fear No Mort, Rick encounters a simulation of Diane inside a place called the Fear Hole, a location that traps people inside their own worst fears and makes them feel completely real. The simulation of Diane is not the real Diane. Rick knows it cannot be the real Diane because Rick Prime used a device called the Omega device to kill every version of Diane in every dimension that existed. There is no Diane left anywhere. But the simulation is accurate enough that Rick briefly considers jumping into the fear hole just to spend time with her, even knowing it is not real. He decides not to. He chooses the living family in front of him over the dead family behind him. The show does not announce this as a turning point. It does not play music or have another character comment on it. Rick just decides, quietly, and moves on. But for a man who built a machine to keep his dead wife's voice alive so he would never stop hurting, the decision not to chase even a simulation of her is the most significant choice the show has ever given him. Nietzsche's answer to the passive nihilism that grief produces is not happiness. It is not resolution. It is what he called amor fati, love of fate. The acceptance of everything that happened, including the worst of it, not as something to be avenged or escaped or medicated into silence, but as the specific path that made you, specifically you. The thing that happened to Rick was catastrophic. The path it put him on was destructive and lonely, and cost him and everyone around him enormously. Amor fati does not pretend this was good. It says, this was the path. This is what it produced. Now what will you build from here? Rick standing at the fear hole and choosing not to jump is the first real moment in the show where that answer starts to take shape. But before the answer, there was the catchphrase. And the catchphrase was there from the very first episode, saying everything the philosophy was built to hide, loud enough for everyone to hear, and quiet enough that almost no one listened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What it said, what it has always said, and what the audience did with it, that is where this story goes next. Section 7, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub, when the catchphrase is a confession. It is in Season 1, Episode 5. A character named Bird Person is standing at a party talking to Summer, Rick's granddaughter. Rick is across the room being Rick, loud, chaotic, performing, and Summer, watching her grandfather, asks Bird Person what Wubba Lubba Dub Dub actually means, because Rick says it constantly. He shouts it when something goes well. He shouts it when something explodes. He shouts it at the end of sentences that do not need an ending. It has become his signature, the thing people quote when they are doing an impression of him, the sound that, more than anything else, has come to represent who Rick Sanchez is. Bird Person looks at Summer and says it simply, without drama, without a long pause for effect. In his people's language, he says, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub means, I am in great pain. Please help me. Summer laughs. The show moves on in about 6 seconds. That is it. No dramatic music, no reaction shot held long enough to make you feel the weight of it, no follow-up conversation. The show drops the single most important piece of information it will ever give you about its main character, wraps it in a joke, and moves on so quickly that most people watching for the first time laugh along with Summer and forget it happened before the next scene begins. This was a deliberate choice, not an accident of pacing, not a moment the writers threw in without thinking about it. The choice to make Rick's deepest truth available from the very beginning of the show, packaged as a throwaway punchline, is the show's argument about itself, stated in miniature. The truth is always there. It is never hidden. It is shouted constantly at the top of his lungs, and the people around him and the audience watching him choose not to hear it because it is more comfortable to laugh. Nietzsche wrote that the deepest truths are always the ones a culture converts into jokes. He meant that when something is too uncomfortable to be taken seriously, the people who encounter it reach for laughter as a way of acknowledging it without having to sit with it. The joke lets you touch the truth without holding it. You can say you heard it, you responded to it, you were there when it was said, and then you can move on without it changing anything about how you see the person who said it or the world they are describing. Wubba Lubba Dub Dub is the perfect delivery system for this. It sounds like nonsense. It sounds like the kind of thing a cartoon character says because cartoon characters need catchphrases. It sounds fun to shout. It sounds good on a t-shirt. By the time Bird Person tells Summer what it actually means, the audience has already been trained to hear it as entertainment, and the training is strong enough that the translation lands as a joke rather than a confession. "I am in great pain. Please help me," said over and over and over again across seasons, in every situation, at the top of his voice. Said at parties and in spaceships and in alien prisons and at breakfast and in the middle of fights and in the garage alone at night. Said so often it became background noise. Said so loudly it disappeared. Now go back and watch the show knowing this. Watch Rick say it after something genuinely terrible has happened. Watch him say it right after a moment where the costume slips, where something he claimed not to care about clearly hurt him, where someone he claimed to have no feelings for does something that lands in a way he cannot fully control. Watch him shout it and grin and perform the chaos and move on to the next thing. It does not sound like a catchphrase anymore. It sounds like a man screaming in a language nobody speaks. This is what the alcoholism is doing in the same structure. Rick drinks in the second episode of season 2 at a level that an entire planet's population cannot keep up with. He drinks in the garage before the suicide attempt. He drinks in every episode at every hour for reasons the show never presents as recreational or social. Unity, the hive mind he used to date, tells him in her goodbye letter that recreational substances were phased out in her world because there is no need for escape from the self when your world is unified. She is telling him directly that his drinking is escape, that the thing he is escaping from is himself, that the self he is escaping from is in great pain and asking for help in the only language it has left. The show gives you the translation in season 1, episode 5. It gives you the explanation in season 2, episode 3. Both pieces of information are available early, stated plainly, and wrapped in enough noise that the audience can choose not to hear them if choosing not to hear them is more comfortable. Most of the audience chose not to hear them. And here is where the catchphrase stops being just a detail about Rick Sanchez and becomes something that implicates the people watching him. Rick and Morty became one of the most watched shows on television during its third season. It was pulling in numbers that had not been seen for an animated series in years. The fan base was enormous and passionate and extremely online. They quoted the show constantly. They made memes. They wore the catchphrase on clothing. They debated theories about the multiverse and the Citadel and what Rick's true backstory meant. They engaged with the show's intelligence and matched it, or tried to, with their own. And a significant portion of them idolized Rick Sanchez. They saw in him the thing they wanted to be, the person who was smarter than everyone around them, who operated outside the rules that constrained ordinary people, who did not care what anyone thought and moved through the world on his own terms, and was impossible to hurt because nothing mattered enough to hurt him. They heard a man saying, "I am in great pain, please help me," and decided he was their hero. Nietzsche described this exact failure in his writing about the last man and the herd. He said that the herd does not recognize the Ubermensch because the Ubermensch is beyond the herd's frame of reference. But he also described something else, the way that the herd romanticizes certain performances of strength without understanding what is being performed. The person who shouts loudly about not caring is performing something the herd finds appealing because it looks like freedom from the things the herd secretly wishes it were free from too. The audience does not ask whether the performance is real. They do not ask what is behind the wall. They adopt the aesthetic of the wall and call it a worldview. The Rick and Morty fan base, at its most toxic, did this with surgical precision. They adopted the aesthetic of not caring, the nihilism, the arrogance, the performance of being too intelligent for ordinary human concerns, and turned it into an identity. They built a sense of themselves as people who understood something that others did not. The catchphrase became proof of membership. Saying it meant you were in on something. They were not in on anything. They had absorbed the costume and mistaken it for the face. Dan Harmon, the co-creator of the show, watched this happen and was not subtle about his reaction. He called sections of the fan base knobs. He was disgusted by the way certain fans had taken Rick's nihilism and used it to justify cruelty, arrogance, and the harassment of the show's female writers. He had built a show about a man whose not caring was a performance covering devastating pain, and a significant portion of the audience had taken the performance at face value and built a community around it. The show responded to this directly in season 3. The entire arc of the season was built around making Rick demonstrably worse, not in a shocking way, but in a specific, consistent way that removed the romance from his behavior. It showed the consequences of his choices landing on the people around him with more weight than earlier seasons had allowed. It gave Dr. Wong the scene in Pickle Rick where she dismantles Rick's self-image with calm, accurate accurate, completely unanswerable precision. It constructed season-long evidence that the man the fanbase had turned into an icon was a deeply unwell person whose worldview was causing ongoing damage to everyone who loved him. The fans who had been wearing the costume were not pleased. Some of them complained that the show had gotten worse, that it had lost what made it great, that it was being tampered with by outside influences. They could not articulate why Season 3 felt wrong to them, because articulating it would have required them to say, "This season is making it harder for me to pretend that Rick is something to aspire to." Nietzsche wrote, "What is the greatest experience you can have? It is the hour of the great contempt, in which your happiness, your reason, your virtue, your justice become disgusting to you." He meant the moment when the thing you have been using to define yourself reveals itself as insufficient, when the identity you built stops holding, when the costume falls off and what is underneath it is not what you expected. Season 3 was the show's attempt to give its audience that moment. Some of them took it. Many put the costume back on and kept wearing it. The catchphrase is still on t-shirts. It is still being shouted at cameras. The translation is still available in Season 1, Episode 5 for anyone who wants to look it up. The information has never been hidden. The confession has always been right there, loud and constant, in a language nobody learned to speak. "I am in great pain. Please help me." And the world blinks, says it discovered happiness, and buys the merchandise. But here is what the merchandise misses, what the fan base missed, what even a lot of careful viewers of the show missed. The catchphrase is not the darkest thing the show has done. The catchphrase is the surface. Underneath it, in the actual structure of the fandom itself, something happened that Nietzsche had described in precise detail more than 100 years before it occurred. Something that turned the audience of a show about the dangers of herd behavior into the most spectacular demonstration of herd behavior that adult animation has ever accidentally produced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That story involves a fast food chain, a discontinued sauce, and a crowd of people screaming at minimum wage workers while shouting the name of a cartoon pickle. Section 8. The Fandom as the Last Man. The Szechuan Sauce Riots. On April 1st, 2017, Adult Swim aired the Season 3 premiere of Rick and Morty without any announcement. No build-up, no marketing campaign, no warning. It simply appeared, unannounced, on a loop for the entire day. Millions of people who had been waiting nearly 2 years for new episodes suddenly had one, and they watched it over and over as it repeated throughout the day. The episode is called The Rick Shank Redemption. In it, Rick is trapped inside a Federation prison, and the episode follows his escape. Near the end, after Rick has dismantled an entire galactic government from the inside, using nothing but his own intelligence, he pulls Morty aside and delivers a speech that the show intends as a warning. He tells Morty that his real motivation, the thing underneath all the apparent heroism of what just happened, was not to save his family or defeat his enemies. It was to get rid of Jerry. Everything else was a side effect. And then, almost as a joke tacked onto the end of a dark speech, Rick announces his new life goal. He says he wants to find the McDonald's Szechuan dipping sauce that was released as a promotion for the Disney movie Mulan back in 1998. He says this is his series arc. He says he wants it for 9 more seasons. He says he wants it for 97 years. It is a joke about the smallness of obsession. A joke about a man who can dismantle governments, spending his energy chasing a discontinued condiment. The writers were making fun of Rick. They were showing that the smartest being in the universe could be just as petty and trivial and fixated on something meaningless as anyone else. The sauce was the punchline. Rick's desire for it was the joke. The audience heard something completely different. Within hours of the episode airing, fans were contacting McDonald's asking for the sauce to come back. Within days, there were online petitions. Within weeks, the demand had grown loud enough that McDonald's noticed. The company sent a large container of the sauce to Justin Roiland, one of the show's creators, as a publicity gesture. The fans took this as confirmation that the sauce was coming back officially. The pressure continued to build. On October 7th, 2017, McDonald's brought back the Szechuan sauce for 1 day only, at a small number of locations across the United States. They did not prepare adequately for what happened next. Hundreds of fans showed up at McDonald's locations across the country. Lines stretched around buildings. When stores ran out of sauce, which happened quickly because McDonald's had dramatically underestimated how many people would come, the crowds did not leave. They did not shrug and go home. They rioted. Fights broke out. Staff were verbally abused by customers screaming at them over a dipping sauce. Police were called to multiple locations to manage crowds that had become dangerous dangerous. One fan jumped onto the counter of a McDonald's, got down on the floor, and rolled around screaming, "I am Pickle Rick," referencing a different episode from the same season, before running out of the store. Justin Roiland posted publicly that he had nothing to do with the McDonald's situation and asked fans to please be kind to the employees because it was not their fault. He was embarrassed. Dan Harmon was embarrassed. The creators of a show about the danger of following things blindly watched their fan base follow something blindly into a fast food riot over a sauce that, by all accounts, was not even particularly good. Now, step back and look at what actually happened here. The season 3 premiere joke was specifically about how even the most intelligent person can be consumed by the most trivial possible desire. Rick, the being who can cross infinite dimensions, who just destroyed an entire government's economy, who claims that nothing in the universe is worth genuine attachment, announces that his deepest motivation is a dipping sauce from 1998. The joke is that his desire for the sauce is indistinguishable from the kind of petty, comfort-seeking, herd-level wanting that he spends every episode performing contempt for. He is the last man in that moment. He just does not know it. The audience watched this and decided the sauce was worth rioting over. They did not absorb the joke. They absorbed the object of the joke. They took the thing Rick wanted and wanted it too. Not because the sauce meant anything to them before the episode aired, but because Rick wanted it, and Rick was the thing they had organized their identity around. The signal came. Rick wants the sauce, and the herd moved. No individual reasoning, no personal history with the product, no genuine desire that existed before the signal, just the signal, and then the movement, and then the consequences of movement without thought. Nietzsche described herd morality as the set of values that emerges when people stop thinking individually and start taking direction from the group. He described the last man as someone who has lost the ability to want things for himself, who consumes what is offered, follows what is signaled, and mistakes the comfort of collective movement for the satisfaction of genuine desire. The last man does not choose the sauce. The last man is told the sauce exists, and told that wanting it is the correct response, and blinks and wants it contentedly without examining why. The Rick and Morty fan base, in October 2017, became the most literal possible demonstration of this process. A show about a man who performs contempt for the herd produced a herd. A show about the danger of following signals without individual thought produced a crowd that followed a signal without individual thought all the way to a McDonald's counter and screamed at a minimum wage worker because the condiment had run out. But the sauce riot, as embarrassing as it was, is not even the most revealing thing the fandom did during this period. The most revealing thing was a piece of writing that spread across the internet around the same time. It was a paragraph written as a joke by someone online that became one of the most widely shared pieces of text associated with the show. It went like this. To be fair, you have to have a very high intelligence level to understand Rick and Morty. The humor is extremely subtle, and without a solid understanding of science, most of the jokes will go over a typical viewer's head. Rick's nihilistic outlook is carefully woven into his character, and his personal philosophy draws heavily from complex literature. The fans understand this. They have the mental capacity to truly appreciate the depth of the jokes. As a consequence, people who dislike Rick and Morty are genuinely less intelligent. Of course they would not appreciate it. This paragraph was written as a parody, as a mockery of exactly the kind of fan behavior it described. And yet, it spread through the fan base not as a joke that fans were in on, but as something a significant number of fans shared and agreed with. It became a genuine expression of how certain fans actually felt about themselves in relation to the show and in relation to people who did not watch it. A show about the arrogance of a man who uses intelligence as armor had produced fans who used the show as armor. A show about the emptiness of feeling superior to everyone around you had produced fans who felt superior to everyone around them because they watched it. A show that was actively, explicitly, in Season 3, trying to dismantle the romanticization of its own main character had produced fans who used the main character to justify their own sense of being special. Nietzsche's description of the herd includes something specific about how the herd handles things it perceives as markers of superiority. The herd does not actually want to be extraordinary. It wants to feel extraordinary without doing the work that extraordinary requires. So it finds symbols, the right show, the right character, the right catchphrase, the right sauce, and it gathers around those symbols and uses them as proof of its own exceptional nature. The membership in the group that appreciates the thing becomes the substitute for the individual development that genuine exceptionalism would require. The Rick and Morty fan base, at its most toxic, was not full of people who had engaged deeply with what the show was actually saying. It was full of people who had found a symbol of intelligence and used proximity to the symbol as evidence of their own. They had done what the last man always does. They had discovered happiness, looked at each other, and blinked. Dan Harmon watched all of this and called them knobs. He publicly expressed his disgust with the fans who harassed female writers the show had hired during season 3. He had built a show about a man whose performance of not caring was destroying everyone around him, and a section of his audience had performed not caring at actual human beings who worked on the show. The creators of Rick and Morty had not made a show that attracted a toxic fandom by accident. They had made a show about a specific kind of cultural failure, and the specific kind of cultural failure had shown up in the audience like a response to an invitation it did not know it had received. Nietzsche warned that the last man would be the hardest figure for civilization to shake, because the last man is comfortable. He does not suffer enough to want to change. He does not feel the gap between what he is and what he could be, because he has filled that gap with small pleasures and group membership and the quiet, satisfied certainty that he has already figured out the important things. The fan who rolled around on a McDonald's floor screaming, "I am Pickle Rick," was not suffering. He was having the time of his life. He was doing what the signal told him to do, surrounded by people doing the same thing, feeling completely connected to something larger than himself, completely certain that he understood what he was participating in. He did not understand what he was participating in, and the show had been telling him so since season 1. But the show told him in a language he had decided was entertainment, and entertainment does not ask you to change. It just asks you to keep watching. What the audience missed, what nearly everyone missed, is that the show was not just a warning about Rick. It was a warning about what happens to the people who organize their lives around someone like Rick. Not the fictional people inside the show, though the show documents that damage carefully. The real people, the ones watching, the ones wearing the catchphrase on their shirts without knowing what it means. The ones who would need to hear about a very specific multiverse and a very specific decision made at the edge of it before they would understand what the show had been building toward all along. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That decision, and what it finally reveals about the difference between the rope and the abyss, is where this story has been going since the breakfast table in episode 1. Section 9, The Eternal Recurrence and the Infinite Multiverse. There is a thought experiment Nietzsche described that he considered the heaviest idea a human being could carry. He called it the eternal recurrence. The idea is simple to describe and almost impossible to sit with. Imagine that your life, everything that has ever happened to you, every good moment and every terrible one, every choice and every consequence, every morning you woke up happy and every night you lay awake wishing things were different. Imagine that this exact life repeats, not once, forever. The same moments in the same order with no variation and no escape, cycling through eternity without end. Nietzsche was not saying this is literally true. He was using it as a test. He was asking, if you knew your life would repeat exactly as it has been forever, could you say yes to it? Could you look at everything that happened, including the worst of it, especially the worst of it, and want it to happen again? Could you love your fate so completely that the idea of its eternal repetition felt like a gift rather than a sentence? The person who could say yes to this, fully and genuinely, was the closest Nietzsche could get to describing what the Ubermensch would feel. Not happiness exactly, something harder and more honest than happiness. A complete, unqualified acceptance of the specific life you have lived as the only life worth living. The willingness to choose it again and again and again without revision. Rick and Morty built an entire universe that asks the same question. It just asked it with a portal gun instead of a philosophical thought experiment. The multiverse in Rick and Morty is not just a storytelling device that lets the writers put characters in interesting situations. It is the eternal recurrence made structural. It is the thought experiment made real and then handed to a character and watched to see what he does with it. Because if you have access to infinite parallel dimensions, if every version of every choice you could ever make already exists somewhere, then the question of whether you can say yes to your specific life becomes the most urgent question imaginable. Rick cannot say yes. He has never been able to say yes, and the portal gun is the proof. Look at what happens in the 6th episode of season 1 called Rick Potion Number 9. Rick and Morty accidentally destroy their home dimension. The population of Earth has been mutated beyond recovery. There is no fixing it. Rick's solution is to find a parallel dimension where a different version of himself had already solved an identical problem, but where that version of Rick Rick and that version of Morty had both just died. He and Morty travel to that dimension, bury the bodies of their alternate selves, and move in. New Rick, new Morty, same family, different dimension. Problem solved. Morty does not recover from this quickly. He sits in the backyard next to his own grave and has what the show simply lets be a breakdown. No jokes, no resolution, no scene where someone explains why it is okay. He is a teenage boy sitting next to the body of himself in a dimension that is not his, and the show holds that for long enough to make it feel like what it is. Rick does not have a breakdown. Rick had already done this before. The ease with which he executes the move, the casual efficiency of it, tells you that this is not the first time he has relocated to a better dimension when the current one became inconvenient. The portal gun makes this possible. The portal gun makes every dimension provisional, and a life that can always be exchanged for a parallel version of itself is a life that can never be fully said yes to, because the yes only counts if you cannot leave. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence only works as a test because you cannot escape it. The weight of the question comes from its permanence. If you could simply move to a dimension where things went better, the question would lose its teeth entirely. You would never have to choose your life because you could always find a slightly improved version of it somewhere else. You would never have to love your fate because you could always upgrade your fate. This is Rick's trap. He built the escape route himself and then spent his whole life using it, and the using of it has made the thing it was escaping from permanently unavailable. He cannot say yes to any single life because he has had too many lives. He cannot commit to any single dimension because there are always infinite others. He cannot build meaning in one place because the portal gun makes every place equally real and therefore equally disposable. In the 4th season episode called The Vat of Acid episode, Rick gives Morty a device that works like a save point in a video game. Morty can press a button and save his current position, then press it again later and return to that exact moment if things go wrong. Morty uses it to escape consequences over and over. Bad conversations, awkward situations, choices that did not work out. The device makes his life feel controllable and safe. And then Rick reveals what the device actually did. Morty was not traveling back in time. He was jumping to a parallel dimension where a different version of himself had been living the life Morty abandoned. Every time Morty pressed the button and went back, an alternate Morty died in the life Morty left behind. Morty had been killing versions of himself without knowing it. Every time he decided his current situation was too uncomfortable to stay in. The episode ends with Rick forcing Morty to feel the full weight of this. He makes Morty experience every consequence of every decision he erased. The relationships, the events, the losses, all compressed into a single, overwhelming sequence that leaves Morty devastated. Rick is not being cruel for the sake of cruelty. He is teaching Morty what the portal gun had taught Rick and what Rick had never fully learned himself. The ability to escape consequences does not remove their reality. It just moves their damage somewhere else. This is the eternal recurrence question asked in reverse. Not can you say yes to your life repeating forever, but can you live with the knowledge that every escape you took left something real behind? Can you look at the trail of abandoned dimensions and say, yes, I chose this, and the choosing was worth it? Rick cannot answer this question cleanly. He has too many abandoned dimensions behind him, too many versions of situations where he could have stayed and did not, too many moments where the portal gun was easier than the conversation, where the next dimension was cleaner than the consequences of the current one. He has been answering Nietzsche's eternal recurrence question with the portal gun for decades, and the answer has always been the same. Not this one, try another. Look at what happens in Season 1, Episode 8, called Rick's Minutes. Rick and Morty are watching television from alternate dimensions, a device Rick built that lets them see how lives played out in parallel versions of reality. Beth and Jerry find a channel that shows them the alternate versions of their own lives, the paths they did not take, and what those paths produced. Beth sees an alternate version of herself who became a surgeon instead of a horse doctor. Jerry sees an alternate version of himself who became a successful actor. Both alternate versions are more successful by conventional measures. Both Beth and Jerry are devastated by this. They are watching proof that their current lives, the lives they are actually living, are the diminished versions, the ones where things did not work out as well as they could have. Morty watches them fall apart and does something remarkable. He takes Summer outside, to the backyard, to the spot where he and Rick buried their bodies when they first arrived in this dimension, and he explains to Summer what it felt like. He tells her, nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody is going to die. Come watch television. Most people hear this as nihilism, as Morty having absorbed Rick's worldview and applying it to make Summer feel better about having accidentally discovered that her parents wished she had never been born. And it is partly that, but it is also something else. It is Morty who has literally sat next to his own own grave, choosing to stay in this dimension anyway, choosing to keep going, choosing to watch television with his sister in a life that did not go the way it could have gone, in a body that replaced a dead one, in a family that is held together by the smallest possible threads. That choice, small, undramatic, completely without heroism, is the closest the show gets in its early seasons to answering Nietzsche's question. Not Rick, Morty, the boy who was dragged into the infinite and chose, quietly, to stay somewhere specific anyway. Rick watches Morty make choices like this repeatedly across the show's run. He watches and says nothing and performs indifference and keeps moving. But something in the movement changes, slowly, so gradually it is almost invisible. The dimensions Rick moves through start mattering slightly more. The exits start being used slightly less. The family in this specific garage, in this specific dimension, starts pulling at him in ways he cannot fully override with philosophy. In Season 7, Episode 10, called Fear No Mort, Rick stands at the edge of a fear hole, a place that creates perfect simulations of whatever the person entering it fears most and loves most at the same time. Inside this fear hole is a simulation of Diane. Rick knows it is not real. He knows she is gone from every dimension that exists because of what Rick Prime did. He knows that walking into the fear hole would be choosing a simulation over reality. He almost goes in anyway. He stands at the edge and considers it, and then he turns around. He chooses the real family over the simulated one. He chooses the imperfect, difficult, complicated, often painful specific life he has in this specific dimension over the comfortable unreality of the one the fear hole is offering. Nietzsche called this amor fati, love of fate. The acceptance not just of the good parts of your life, but of the whole of it. The losses, the wounds, the dimensions you destroyed, the bodies in the backyard, the Diane AI running alone in an empty house, the garage scene, all of it, as the specific path that brought you to this specific moment. Not happiness, not resolution, just the willingness to choose what is real over what is comfortable. Rick turns away from the fear hole without announcement, without a speech. The show does not hold on it. It moves on. But something has shifted, something quiet and permanent. The man who built an infinite escape route has chosen, at the edge of the most appealing exit the show has ever offered him, to stay. The eternal recurrence is the heaviest question Nietzsche ever asked. Rick and Morty answered it not with philosophy, but with a man standing at a hole in the ground, looking at a simulation of everything he lost and walking away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What that decision cost him, and what it made possible, is where the final section of this story begins. Because the revenge is over, the costume is thinning, the exit has been refused, and the question that remains, the one the show has been building toward since the breakfast table in Episode 1, is what a man does with himself when he finally stops running. Section 10. After the revenge. What happens when there's nothing left to run from? There is a specific kind of emptiness that only arrives after you have spent decades organizing your life around one goal and then achieved it. Not the emptiness of failure. Failure at least comes with the possibility that trying again might produce something different. This is the emptiness of completion. The moment when the thing you have been running toward is finally behind you and you turn around to look at what is in front of you and you realize you never built anything there because all the building was pointed backward at the one thing you were chasing. Rick Sanchez spent what the show confirms was approximately 40 years hunting Rick Prime. 40 years of crossing infinite dimensions, building weapons, forming alliances, killing alternate versions of himself, constructing the Citadel and then abandoning it, crashing into the Smith family garage and dragging his grandson into danger across every corner of the universe. All of it flowing from a single point, the bomb that came through the portal, the two people who died, the version of himself responsible for their deaths. Everything Rick performed, the nihilism, the arrogance, the constant forward motion, the philosophy of nothing matters, was built on top of that point, not as a worldview he had reasoned his way into, as a survival structure he had constructed over a wound that was never allowed to close, because closing it would have meant stopping the hunt. In Season 7, Episode 5, called Unmortricken, Rick finds Rick Prime and kills him. The fight is not what 40 years of buildup might suggest it would be. There is no triumphant music. There is no moment where Rick stands over his defeated enemy and feels the release of everything that was promised by the revenge. The killing is exhausting and messy, and when it is over, Rick is not transformed. He is not healed. He is not the Ubermensch on the far side of his greatest trial, finally ready to create meaning in the space where grief used to live. He is just tired. The show holds on his face after it is done. Not for long. Just long enough to let you see that the expression is not satisfaction. It is the specific blankness of a person who has just discovered that the thing they were carrying was not a burden keeping them from peace. It was the peace itself. The hunting was the structure. The revenge was the reason to keep moving. And now the hunting is over, and the revenge is complete, and the structure has dissolved. And underneath it, there is just a man in his 70s, standing alone, with nothing ahead of him that he has ever thought about. Nietzsche spent significant time writing about what he called the danger of the void left by the death of meaning. He was not talking only about the death of God. He was talking about any organizing principle that a person has used to give their life direction. Any external thing that a person points themselves at and says, as long as I am moving toward that, I have a reason to keep going. When that thing is achieved or destroyed or simply runs out, the person is left with the void, and the void does not wait patiently while you figure out what to build next. It asks the question immediately, what are you for now? Rick has no answer to this question. He has never needed to answer it because he has never been without the hunt long enough to feel its absence. The nihilism was useful while the hunt was ongoing, because the nihilism justified keeping everyone at a distance, kept the wound open, kept the movement constant. Without the hunt, the nihilism loses its job. It does not disappear, but it stops being necessary in the way it was before. And a tool that was built for a specific purpose and has lost that purpose does not quietly go away. It just sits there, taking up space, reminding you of what it was for. After Rick Prime is dead, Rick does something that Season 1 Rick would have been unrecognizable in. He keeps going to therapy. Not as a performance, not as something he attends and then argues his way out of and uses as evidence of how enlightened he is for participating. He goes to Dr. Wong regularly in Seasons 6 and 7. He processes, slowly, reluctantly, with enormous resistance and frequent attempts to turn the sessions into intellectual arguments he can win. But he goes, and the going changes him in ways that the show does not announce, but simply shows through the accumulation of small choices that are slightly different from the choices the old Rick would have made. In Season 7, Episode 3, called Air Force Wong, Rick goes back to Dr. Wong after a difficult situation involving the President of the United States. The episode is partly comedic, partly genuine. What matters is the ending. Rick, who in Season 2, Episode 3 went home from heartbreak and tried to kill himself in his garage, goes home from a different, difficult situation in Season 7 and does something different. He does not drink himself into a collapse. He goes to see the President and they work something out between them. The show does not editorialize about this. It just shows you the different choice being made and trusts you to notice. Dr. Wong herself noted the parallel in the episode. She pointed out that Rick went back to his garage, just like in Season 2, but this time he chose differently. This is what recovery actually looks like. Not a dramatic transformation, not a speech or a revelation or a moment where everything clicks and the broken person becomes whole. It looks like going back to the same place where you once almost ended everything and making a slightly less destructive choice, and then making that choice again and again. Each time with the same amount of difficulty, each time without guarantee that the next time will be easier. Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming was not about dramatic transformation. It was about the continuous, daily, unglamorous work of choosing differently than your worst instincts would have you choose. Not because someone told you to, not because a reward was waiting on the other side, because you have decided from inside yourself that the person you have been being is not the full extent of what you can be. The Ubermensch is not a destination, it is a direction. And the first step in that direction is not triumph. It is the refusal of the most familiar, self-destructive option available to you on an ordinary Tuesday. Rick is taking that step quietly, without announcement, in small, deniable, easily missed moments across Seasons 6 and 7. The show trusts its audience to notice without being told what they are seeing. And then there is the Season 7 finale, Fear No Mort. Morty enters a fear hole, a location that pulls people into a simulation built from their deepest fears and most powerful desires, mixing them together until the person inside cannot tell which is which. Inside the fear hole, Morty experiences a version of reality where Rick did not follow him in, where Rick was not there, where Morty had to navigate the simulation alone. Except Morty did not navigate it alone. There was a Rick with him the whole time. A Rick who knew what to do and how to help, and who stayed close and kept Morty moving forward through the fear. A Rick who was, by every observable measure, exactly what Morty needed. The twist at the end of the episode reveals that this Rick was never real. Rick never followed Morty into the fear hole. Morty was alone the entire time. The Rick he experienced, helpful, present, genuinely there, was a version of Rick that Morty's own mind created out of everything he knows about his grandfather, out of every adventure and every lesson and every moment where the real Rick, beneath all the costume and the philosophy and the performance, showed up for him in ways that were real even when they were wrapped in something that looked like indifference. Morty Morty's worst fear, the fear hole reveals, is a world where Rick does not need him. Not a world where Rick is gone. A world where Rick is fine without him. Where the connection that Morty has organized a significant part of his identity around turns out to have been one-sided. Where Rick's presence in his life was always more about convenience than genuine care. The show places this fear at the center of its final episode of Season 7, and then answers it not with a speech from Rick, but with a simple fact. The Rick Morty's mind built, the Rick his subconscious constructed from years of close observation, was a good one, was a helpful one, was one that stayed. This means Morty has seen enough of the real Rick, in enough unguarded moments over enough years to build a version of him that knows how to show up. The raw material was there. The genuine care was present often enough and clearly enough that a 14-year-old boy absorbing it without being told it existed could reconstruct it accurately under pressure. Rick, learning about this later, briefly considers going into the fear hole himself to see Diane, to spend time in a simulation of the life that was taken from him. He stands at the edge of it, the camera holds on him, and then he turns away. He chooses the real over the comfortable. He chooses Morty and Summer and Beth and even Jerry, the living, difficult, imperfect, Tuesday-sized family in front of him, over the simulation of the family he lost. He does this without a speech, without a declaration, without any of the philosophical framework he has spent 40 years building to explain why caring about people is beneath him. He just turns around and goes home. Nietzsche wrote that the highest form of human existence is not the escape from suffering, but the full acceptance of the specific life you have been given, including the suffering, especially the suffering, as the path that made you who you are. He called this amor fati, love of fate, not happiness, not resolution, the willingness to look at everything and say, yes, this was mine, this was the life, not the simulation, not the parallel dimension, not the alternate timeline where Diane lived and the bomb never came, and Rick never had to build a wall to survive. This one, with these people, in this garage. Rick turning away from the fear hole is the show's quietest and most complete answer to the question Nietzsche spent his career asking. Not delivered by the smartest person in the universe in a monologue about the nature of existence. Delivered through a physical choice made in silence, at the edge of the most appealing exit the show has ever offered him, by a man who is finally, exhaustedly, cautiously beginning to choose what is real. The warning Nietzsche issued more than 100 years ago was not about Rick Sanchez specifically. It could not have been. But it was about everything Rick Sanchez is. The man who kills God and has to live in the silence. The Ubermensch who refuses to arrive. The brilliant person who uses intelligence as armor. The grief that wears philosophy as a costume. The herd that forms around the performance of not caring. The fandom that absorbs the confession without hearing it. Rick is not the villain of this story. He's not even really the warning. He is the symptom. The thing Nietzsche pointed at and said, this is what happens when a culture loses its ceiling and does not build a new one. This is what a person looks like when they are right about the meaninglessness of everything and cannot find their way to building meaning anyway. This is the rope over the abyss, fraying in the middle, unable to move forward, unwilling to go back, holding on because underneath the philosophy and the alcohol and the portal gun and the garage, there is something that has survived everything. The ability to turn away from the simulation and go home to the people who are real. That is not nothing. For a man who spent 40 years insisting that nothing was the point, it is, quietly, everything. But what was done to the people who loved him along the way, what the show built carefully and confirmed slowly, is the part of this story that Rick would never tell you himself. Because the damage that a man like Rick leaves behind does not stay in the garage. It travels. It gets into people. It shapes them. And what it shaped in the boy who spent years sitting next to him in a spaceship, absorbing the philosophy and the chaos and the love disguised as indifference, that is a wound the show spent 7 seasons documenting with a care and a precision that almost no one gave it credit for. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.